Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at New Year's, January 1st. Of course, we're just less than a few days away by the time this episode airs, literally just a few days away from the turning of the new year from 2022 to 2023. And in this episode, we just want to look at how did it come to be January 1st? How did we land on January 1st being the new year? I mean, after all, sometimes, Chris, when I think about the new year, I think January is an odd time to have it because you would think with spring and everything sort of blooming forth, that would be New Year. But no, we celebrate New Year's in the dead of winter. I wonder why.
Yeah, I think this is one of those topics that we do it, but we don't really know why we do it. And what's crazy about this is, you have this thing called the new year, but then governments sometimes operate on what's known as a fiscal year. There are some that go from, June to May or some other time. So I think it's important for us as we're getting ready to turn a new year and to start a new beginning to kind of figure out, how is it that we're doing the New Year's on January 1st rather than in June or in some other time. And, what I thought was fascinating is that the actual first New Year's celebration that's recorded is all the way back to Mesopotamia, which basically is the beginning of the civilization as we know it, if you will, the land between the two rivers, Mesopotamia, where the ancient Babylonians would have an 11-day festival, which they would celebrate. And basically, Ray, it wasn't that they just decided, hey, let's do a new year, but they based it on lunar orbits and kind of how the Earth rotates. And that date, I think, was actually in March, and they timed it just right to where I think the day and the nighttime were in equal length. And, here we are, as you mentioned, in the dead of winter when it gets dark. We're on East Coast time. I mean, at 5:00, it's dark. And, it does seem odd, but there is a reason why we celebrate on January 1st. And that's why we're here today, to enlighten ourselves as well as our listeners as to how to begin the new year on January 1st.
It's interesting that New Year, or the idea, the concept of a new year, goes back as far as it does. I mean, we're talking going back, like you mentioned, 4,000 plus years in human history, and seeing people celebrate the new year, seeing people do this. Of course, for the Babylonians, it really had to do with the new moon. It had to do with the cycles of the moon and the stars and all of that, which I guess, Chris, you teach world religion. It shouldn't be surprising to us, I guess, that people during this time would base things around things like New Year's around the things they knew. Because, of course, when they looked up at the night sky 4,000 years ago, they didn't have airplanes and street lights and porch lights to dim the view. They saw everything. So it was very, very important to their daily life, their religious life, and also, I guess, how they mapped out an individual year.
Yeah, and it was confusing because the Babylonians might have done it in March, but the Egyptians would do it in a different thing because the Egyptians, they based it on the Nile River and the flooding. And so when the flooding came, to them, that was a new year, thinking about it kind of like in the farming sense, right? When you plant your crops and you go through the process and then you have the harvest, well, then it's time you have a little downtime. And then you plant again. And so for them, it's that cycle of life, if you will. You plant, that's the beginning of a new year. We might call it a new season, a new beginning, a new time. So you have the Egyptians doing one thing, the Babylonians doing another thing. And you've got people in ancient China who are doing it in a different concept. And the reason I think you also see such confusion as to when the new year begins is because there's really no calendar. There's no January and February and March, April, May. That's not a centralized viewpoint. And, we really don't start to see the understanding of the calendar or of 365 days in a year until it gets to the Romans and Julius Caesar and those individuals. And, I still think even then there's confusion because like the early Roman calendar, I think only had 355 days, which we are at 365. So it is extremely hard to try to fit this all in and even get to January 1st.
Yeah. And sometimes when you're even pretty simple dates, and here I'm talking about, like the birth of George Washington, when the calendars were realigned, and we'll talk about this a little later, dates moved. I mean, things moved based on when they fell throughout the year and all of that. So it can be very confusing. It's always very confusing to me. And going back to the Egyptians, it was interesting when you were talking about the Egyptians and the flooding of the Nile. That was central to their life. Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt, at least not in the way we know it today. So, like you said, that was something that was central to their lives. When that flooding came and that water then washed back away, leaving that rich topsoil in place where they would be able to grow their crops and support larger societies and all of that. It makes sense to have that as the start of a new year. It makes sense to maybe put it in March, like the Babylonians did. But again, go back, Chris, why exactly are we putting it in the dead of winter? What exactly happened that caused us to, in the Western world, we talk about Rome or we talk about Greece, ultimately the Europeans and Americans, why are we putting it in the dead of winter?
Well, and once again, it's because it's what benefited the people at that particular time. You start looking at the Babylonians and the Egyptians, of course, they were looking in the nighttime sky. They were thinking about agriculture, farming, establishing a way of life. But the story really comes back to the Romans, who didn't see it as some astronomical event, but it was basically for personal gain or for political gain. And basically what the Romans will do is, we've heard of the Ides of March, where they would normally elect people and that would begin. And that was basically at the beginning in March, when it was the start of military season. The winter had ended and they were ready to go and conquer and establish new territories. And that was because March is named after the god of war, which was Mars. But what happens is that in about 154 BC, the Roman Senate started to experience a rebellion, and they were like, oh my gosh, these people are going to take over and they're going to get in charge, and then we're going to have trouble. So what the early Romans did is they just decided that they would move up the new year to January the 1st so that they could elect people that they wanted to be in charge, that they would lead, and to try to prevent people from taking power. And so the early Romans actually came up with January 1st in the dead of winter to begin a new year, not because of anything other than protecting their own power, their own personal sense of satisfaction.
Yeah, and I believe Julius Caesar was the emperor by that point, right?
Well, he comes in a little bit later and he kind of adds on to that, and begins to think, okay, because what happens is Rome has this calendar that, in 156, but by I think it was 46 BC, that's when Julius Caesar is in charge. He's got a civil crisis on his hand, like a civil war. But right. Also the problem is he's got this calendar that he's still dealing with. And the reason that he's dealing with it is because it's still short 10 days. He's got 355 days. Other people have 365 days, and they're trying to use it to establish reform. And so in 46 BC, that is when we have what's known today as the Julian calendar, which is this vast replacement of the original one that was put in by the early Romans. And so that is the one that basically has been in existence. But Ray, even then, the problem comes, you still have some who want to base it on the orbit, and you've got some wanting to base it on political power. And so even though the Julian calendar is in place, there's still a problem with it. And that refers, and I know we're getting really, really deep with this, but that refers to even now that the timing of it, right? I mean, trying to get to that whole time. And I found this was very interesting in study, that the calendar that Julius Caesar had established didn't align with what's known as the solar year. And, that there was a broad difference to it, because if you look at a solar year, there is actually 365.2422 days instead of the normal 365 days, which scientists actually added it up. And I think it's like there's an extra 5 hours and 48 minutes and 46 seconds that's out there that has to be accounted for using all of this. And so for like 1600 years that this Julian calendar is being used, the timing is mixed up. They're like ahead of themselves like 11 minutes. Now, we don't really pay attention to that anymore because we kind of do a 24-hour system, but that really messed up the Europeans, who were focusing on planting, as you mentioned, and, the fall and the spring and the winter seasons. And so they're now like really off as it relates to the calendar. And then, of course, we've talked about political power, agricultural reasons, but then there's another reason that comes in for January 1st. And Ray, that has to do with religion. Then religion has a big, all with the Catholic Church, almost creates a big schism, a big separation with the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and Julius Caesar is an interesting figure. I must confess, you clearly know more about this than I do. Julius Caesar, what I remember of him is he was a man who was not afraid to get in there and stir things up through reform. Whether it was, I know he put in place a series of moral reforms in society. He ended up having trouble, I believe, with one of his daughters who really wasn't living up to the standards he was trying to put in place with everybody else. But here again, with the calendar, is just another reformation that Julius Caesar was trying to put in place. So this is a man who, I guess, was not afraid to say, well, this needs to change. We need to move in a different direction with this. And when you talk about January 1, doesn't that have to do with Roman religion? Another reason that he wanted January 1 as the start of the new year, having to do with his religion there?
Yeah, and that's a key ingredient with all of this is, and I just think it's fascinating how the things that we talk about today that are very important to people, such as religion and power and politics and even agriculture, that it played such a vital role even in establishing New Year's first, but the calendar and even the time, because he was, we mentioned that, Mars was the god of war for the ancient Romans. And of course, you have all of these other gods and goddesses and things of that nature. So it did play a part. And that's why it was created for January 1st. But then, I go back to that whole thing about timing, that Julius Caesar's calendar worked well for the Romans, but it didn't work well for the Europeans. But the Europeans don't catch on for like 1600 years. I mean, there's this long stretch of time that goes on. And finally, I think it was 16th century. I don't remember exact years of whatever, but there was this Pope that was Pope Gregory. Pope Gregory the 13th, I believe, is who it was. And he recognized that there was going to be a serious problem. And Pope Gregory the 13th, by the way, of course, for our listeners who might not be familiar with how all that religion works out, Pope Gregory is of the Roman Catholic Church, which during the time was the church. It was all of Christendom fell under the Roman Catholics. And he was in a serious dilemma, because what the Europeans were doing and what the Romans were doing were off. And that was going to cause a problem for one of the greatest holidays of all of Christendom, which, by the way, is not Christmas, but it was Easter. And Pope Gregory saw that if we stick with Julius Caesar's calendar, we're going to be celebrating Easter at different times, based on solar orbits and all of that stuff. And since the Easter holiday is the most important holiday for all of Roman Catholics, he was like, oh my gosh, we're going to be observing Easter in the wrong season. We're going to be observing Easter in winter instead of when we normally do in spring. And that's going to cause a problem. And so he decides to act, which is when he puts out his calendar, which is now known as the Gregorian calendar, which is the one that we are still following today because, and this is a whole nother podcast, Ray, but he put in that thing called leap year, which throws everybody off. And God bless the people who have a birthday on February 28th or February 29th. I mean, because technically they lose a year every leap year, which is every 4 years or something.
Every 5 years they have a birthday.
Yeah.
I could handle that. I'd probably still be in my 20s. So
by age, yeah, you would, right? But our physical bodies, of course, would still show that we're getting older and older. But the reason that he did that is because he wanted to bring it back to more of an exact time, that it matched up. So go back once again. He was doing it because of Easter, and so his Gregorian calendar is the one that we follow. We follow today, and that is the one that has moved on. And now, Ray, we were talking off air that some people celebrate Christmas in March. And the reason that some of these people celebrate Christmas in March is because that was this whole controversy. It fit better in their time, in their way, their thing. And so that's when Gregory said, enough's enough. We need one general system. We need to start the year in January. We need to have Christmas in December. And that's what we're going to do. And so he was fixated on January 1st being a new year. And that was in the 15th century. And Ray, you and I still today celebrate New Year's Day on January 1st.
That was 1582 was the first time New Year's was celebrated on January 1st, which it's an interesting history. I must confess, it's one that you have a better grasp on than I do. I have studied some of this sort of at the surface level, but the whole calendar thing just confuses me to no end. It has always confused me.
Yeah, imagine that you're living during this time period, and
I would have never been on time for anything because I would have been totally off.
But it's a good thing, right? Because you could say, hey, I'm celebrating my birthday on the Julius Caesar calendar, and I'm also going to celebrate my birthday on the Gregorian calendar. So technically I got two birthdays.
Yeah, y'all got to give me presents on three different days of the year. You got birthday 1, birthday 2, and Christmas.
So, you can say, and, I think the fascinating thing about this is, not everybody agreed with it. I mean, they didn't, it wasn't just like, the Pope said, this is what we're doing and everybody's fine with it. I mean, you have countries, I think, like Russia decided that they weren't going to celebrate New Year's Day as January 1st. They didn't decide that until like 1918. And even China has the lunar year, right? They've got that whole different calendar or whatever.
And doesn't the Eastern Orthodox there in Russia, don't they celebrate Christmas like in early January 8th, something like that?
Yeah, they have. I mean, it's completely different. And that's because not everybody is still on the same track as far as wanting to follow specific calendar dates by the Gregorian thing or whatever it is. But I would say that January 1st, thanks to Pope Gregory, is the decisive New Year's Day. That is our understanding of it. But it comes from cherry picking different cultures, different time periods, and things like that. So really, when the ball drops in New York on January 1st, it's just a new tradition that we've done that's based on something that happened so many years ago that nobody knows anything about, but was rife with confusion, but was all focused on political power and political power in the religious realm also. So I think it's pretty interesting how it comes out. But I still agree with you. Why in the world do we do it in the darkest days of society?
It's weird. And I was just thinking just a minute ago, we were talking about Eastern Orthodox. We have a colleague at the college who is Eastern Orthodox, and I need to ask her, do you celebrate Christmas twice a year? Because, I know she does celebrate on December 25, but I'm also wondering if she celebrates in January as well. But I'll have to find out.
And, I encourage our listeners that, I don't know, Ray, you might, I don't stay up to watch the ball drop. I don't do that. But if people decide that they're going to stay up and they're going to watch the ball drop, that as they journey into the wee hours of January the 1st, 2023, how cool is it that we're channeling something that has been done since 4,000 years ago, and that it has just eclipsed throughout this time period, but we're still embracing history that maybe we didn't know, but should, as to why we're doing it.
Yes, absolutely. And next week, folks, I know this is the last episode of 2022. For our first episode of 2023, we're going to be talking about various New Year's traditions, not only here in the United States, but around the world. So you'll want to tune in for our first episode of 2023. Chris, thank you. Very important topic, very informative as well. I hope our listeners enjoyed that as much as I did. Please look us up on Facebook, on Twitter. You can find our podcast almost anywhere you get your podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, Anchor, wherever you get your podcast, you can find History You Didn't Know But Should. Leave us a comment or send us a message about a future episode you might be interested in hearing, or comment on an episode that you've already listened to. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
I'll talk to you later.